Story 1. My first night shift as a mortuary student was one I'll never forget. I'd been warned that the job wasn't for the faint of heart, but I figured I could handle it. I'd already made it through the classroom lectures and the clinical prep. How bad could it be? Turns out, nothing prepares you for the real thing. The night started off uneventful. The senior staff were friendly enough, though they had that dark sense of humor you'd expect in this line of work. They showed me the ropes, gave me a rundown of the night's tasks, and then left me to man the station while they handled paperwork in the back. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself that was a good thing. No chaos meant no mistakes. Around midnight, the call came in. A fresh body was being brought in, someone who had passed away less than an hour ago. That wasn't unusual, but the speed of the transfer was. Typically, there's a bit of a delay between the time of death and when the body arrives. This one was rushed though, and I didn't ask why. I figured I'd find out soon enough. When the van pulled up, I helped unload the stretcher. The body was wrapped tightly in a sheet, and the driver gave me a quick nod before heading off. I wheeled the stretcher into the prep room, my gloves already on, ready to get to work. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a sigh. I froze, my hand hovering over the sheet. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights, but I could have sworn I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. My first thought was that the senior staff were messing with me. It was my first night after all, and I wouldn't put it past them to pull a prank. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a cabinet, but there was no one there. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just breathing, it was labored, like someone struggling to catch their breath. My heart started pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I knew it couldn't be real. The body was dead. It had to be. But the sound was so clear, so human, that I couldn't ignore it. I peeled back the sheet slowly, my hands trembling. The face beneath was pale, the lips slightly parted. Nothing moved. No rise and fall of the chest, no twitch of the fingers, just stillness. And yet the sound continued, a low, guttural exhale that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, my mind racing. Was it possible the person wasn't actually dead? Could there have been a mistake? I'd heard stories of people being declared dead only to wake up in the morgue, but those were rare, urban legends mostly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when the senior staff walked in. They took one look at my face and burst out laughing. "First night jitters?" one of them asked, clapping me on the shoulder. There's breathing," I stammered, pointing at the body. They exchanged a glance, their smiles fading. One of them stepped forward, pulling the sheet back further. The sound came again, louder now, and I saw the faintest movement in the chest. My stomach dropped. "Relax," the senior said, waving me off. "It's just gas." "Gas," I repeated, my voice shaky. "Yeah," he said, gesturing at the body. "When someone dies, their body starts releasing gases as it breaks down. Sometimes it pushes air through the vocal cords, makes it sound like they're breathing. Creepy as hell, but totally normal." I stared at him, trying to process what he just said. Normal? There was nothing normal about this. But as I watched, the sound faded, the movement stopped, and the body returned to its eerie stillness. The senior gave me a knowing smile. "You'll get used to it," he said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. Story 2. The funeral home had always been a quiet place for me, a space where the living and the dead could coexist without drama. I liked the graveyard shift. It was peaceful, and the lack of human interaction gave me time to focus on my work. Sure, the occasional draft or creak would raise the hairs on my neck, but it came with the territory. I never believed the place was haunted, not really, but one night changed everything. Earlier in the evening, we got a call from the hospital. A woman had passed away less than an hour before, and they needed us to bring her in. It wasn't my first call like this. It happens more often than you'd think. But something about this one felt different. As soon as we loaded her onto the stretcher, I felt it. A chill, an unease I couldn't quite shake. "Bad air tonight," I said to my coworker, trying to brush off the feeling. He didn't respond, just nodded grimly. Maybe he felt it too. Later in the night, my coworker stepped out for a bit, leaving me alone with her. It didn't bother me at first. I'd done this plenty of times. I got back to my work, organizing tools and prepping paperwork. The quiet was comforting, familiar. But then I heard it, a low moan. I froze, glancing around the room. The sound was faint, almost like a sigh. And for a second, I convinced myself it was just the building settling. Old pipes, maybe. That sort of thing happened all the time. "Relax," I muttered to myself, shaking off the tension. But then it came again. Louder this time. A soft, guttural moan that sent a shiver down my spine. My hands trembled as I picked up my clipboard, trying to distract myself. I told myself it was nothing. Dead bodies don't make noise. I'd been doing this job long enough to know that much, except this one did. The third time I heard it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was unmistakable, coming from her. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was gas escaping the body, something perfectly normal. But it didn't sound normal. It sounded alive. "Okay, enough," I muttered, grabbing the edge of the sheet that covered her. My first thought was that my coworker was messing with me. He'd been teasing me all day about how jumpy I was, and this felt like his kind of prank. "Very funny," I said, yanking the sheet back. "You got me." She grabbed my wrist. Her hand shot up, cold and stiff, fingers locking around my arm with a strength that didn't make sense. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, but her hand was alive, gripping me like she'd been waiting for this moment. I screamed, a sound I didn't even know I was capable of. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, and I bolted for the door. I didn't stop to grab my coat, my keys, or even my car. I ran out into the night, my lungs burning, my legs shaking, until I reached my house. I left everything behind: the funeral home, the job, the body. I'll never go back to that funeral home again. Some things are better left buried. Story 3. I'll never forget the day they wheeled him in. I work with the dead, procure eyes and corneas for transplants mostly. It's one of those jobs that makes people go quiet when you mention it. But the truth is, you get used to the strange stuff. Decay, bloating, discoloration. It all becomes just another part of the job. But there are some cases that stay with you, no matter how much you try to push them out of your mind. And that day at the medical examiner's office, that was one of them. I was working on a fairly routine case, a guy who'd passed away recently, probably in his late 40s. The room was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system, and I was focused on my work, making sure the instruments were clean and everything was prepared. Then the doors opened and a pair of techs wheeled in another body. At first glance, nothing about him seemed unusual. Just another man in the final stages of decay, his skin pale and sagging, his hands limp at his sides. I only looked up briefly, nodding to the techs as they brought him in. But then I noticed the other staff. They weren't their usual calm, detached selves. They looked tense. One of them kept glancing at the gurney like he wanted to bolt out the door. "What's the deal?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You'll see," one of the techs muttered, a little too quiet for my liking. I set down my tools and walked over, the smell of decay hitting me like a wall as I got closer. The man's body looked normal enough from the neck down, aside from the usual signs of decomposition. But his head stopped me cold. His face was gone. Not just decomposed, gone, picked clean, like someone had stripped it down to the bone. A stark white skull stared back at me, its sockets dark and empty, the jaw hanging open in a permanent scream. The skin on his neck was still intact, sagging and gray, which only made the contrast more jarring. It was like someone had taken a Halloween mask and placed it over a decaying body. What happened?" I stammered, my stomach churning. "Cats," one of the techs said, his voice clipped. I blinked. "Cats?" "His cats. Ate his face clean." The tech shook his head, his expression grim. I stared at the body, trying to process what I was seeing. I'd heard stories about pets turning on their owners after death. It's more common than you'd think. But seeing it in front of me was something else entirely. His body was still relatively intact, showing the usual signs of decay, but his face looked like it had been meticulously stripped away, leaving nothing but bone. "Just his face?" I asked, my voice weak. "Just the face," the tech confirmed. "Didn't touch anything else." I stepped back, the smell of the body suddenly overwhelming. The bright white skull seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, standing out against the dull gray of his skin. It didn't look real. It looked theatrical, like something you'd see in a horror movie. But it was real. Too real. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that skull. I could imagine the cats, pacing around his lifeless body, their instincts kicking in as hunger took over. The image played over and over in my mind, and no amount of rationalizing could make it go away. I've worked on hundreds of cases since then, but that man is the one I always think about when people ask me what the job is like. It's not the blood or the decay or the smell that gets to you. It's the moments like that, the ones that remind you how fragile we really are. Story 4. It started off as a simple coffee meetup. I was in western South Dakota for some business when my old friend Mr. Mort invited me to stop by for a cup. He ran a small funeral home, the kind of place that quietly blended into the surroundings, but everyone in town knew its purpose. Mort was the kind of guy you'd expect to own a funeral home. Calm, polite, and always carrying that air of subtle humor when the subject got dark. When I arrived, coffee was ready, and we got to chatting. About 10 minutes in, Mort gave me that look, the one that said he had a favor to ask but didn't want to sound pushy. "Hey," he said, sipping his mug. "While you're here, mind lending a hand? I've got a particularly heavy one, and I could use the help." I stared at him for a second, trying to process what heavy one meant before realizing. He had a body that needed to be cremated, a large one, by the sounds of it. Mort knew I kept in prime shape, and I figured I could help him out. "Sure," I said, shrugging. "Let's do it." He led me out to the garage where the crematorium was set up. It was detached from the funeral home itself, a small utilitarian building built with fireproof material and not much else. Inside, the faint smell of ash lingered in the air as Mort prepped the conveyor belt contraption that would roll the body into the furnace. And then I saw her. The body wrapped in a hospital gown was already waiting on the gurney. She was big, 350, maybe 400 pounds. Mort explained that normally a body this size would be placed in a cardboard coffin for cremation, but she was simply too large to fit. "We'll have to do this directly," he said, sounding matter-of-fact. I nodded, though the logistics of it already seemed daunting. It wasn't easy, but after some careful planning and teamwork, we managed to move her from the gurney to the conveyor belt without dropping her. Mort adjusted the controls, ensuring the belt would guide her smoothly into the furnace. Once she was in, he pushed the button to start the automated process. The furnace roared to life, and Mort grinned as he motioned toward the door. "Coffee's still hot," he said. "Let's take a break." We walked down the street to a cafe and ordered another round. The small town was quiet that morning, the streets almost empty except for the occasional car rolling by. About 20 minutes in, a fire truck sped past the window, its sirens cutting through the stillness. Neither of us thought much of it, just another day for the local fire department. Then another fire truck went by. Mort leaned forward, frowning. "Not a lot of fire trucks in this town," he muttered. We stepped outside, and that's when we saw it. Flames were spilling out of the crematorium, licking up the sides of the building. Thick black smoke poured into the sky, and the faint smell of burnt ham hung in the air. Mort's eyes widened. "Oh, hell," he whispered. "That's us." We rushed back, but the scene was already chaotic. The fire had spread quickly, and firefighters were scrambling to contain it. A slick, oily substance was flowing out of the garage, pooling on the driveway and dripping down the street. The first fire truck had parked too close to the building, and I watched as the hot oil melted through one of its tires, causing it to pop. Firefighters shouted orders, trying to move the trucks further back while spraying the flames with everything they had. Mort flagged down one of the responders. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tense. The firefighter shook his head, grimacing. Looks like something in the furnace leaked out. Hot oil caught fire and spread. It hit me then. The woman's body. Mort explained it later. Her size had left very little space in the furnace for heat to circulate properly. Instead of fully cremating her, the intense heat melted her skin and liquefied her fat reserves, turning them into oil. That oil leaked out of the furnace, ignited, and quickly engulfed the garage in flames. And now, it was flowing downhill, setting anything in its path ablaze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Flaming oil was running down the driveway like a river, sending plumes of smoke into the air. Firefighters sprayed desperately, trying to keep the fire from reaching the funeral home itself. Mort stood there, watching helplessly as his crematorium burned, the smell of burnt ham and ash thickening by the second. It took hours to contain the fire. By the end of it, the garage was a charred shell, the crematorium completely destroyed. Mort sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "Well," he said dryly, "guess I'll have to upgrade." I didn't know what to say. The entire situation was surreal, a mix of horror, disbelief, and absurdity. As we walked back to the cafe, I couldn't shake the image of flaming oil spilling down the street, setting tires on fire and leaving firefighters scrambling. It's a story that sounds too wild to be real, but trust me, I saw it firsthand. And if Mort ever invites me for coffee again, I'm making sure it's just coffee. No favors, no heavy lifting, just caffeine. Story 4. When I got the job at the mortuary, I wasn't exactly looking for something glamorous. Or, emotionally taxing. I just needed a paycheck, and working nights meant fewer people to deal with. The role was simple. Check in the bodies when they came in, log them properly, and put them into cold storage. Sounds straightforward, right? And for a while it was. But then there was that night. It started like any other late shift. The mortuary was quiet, just the hum of the refrigeration units in the background. I'd gotten used to the eerie stillness after a few weeks, though there were moments when I caught myself glancing over my shoulder for no real reason. Just the usual jitters you get when you're alone in a room full of the dead. Around 11 p.m., the first delivery came in, a body from a nearby convalescing home. The folks from the transport team brought her in, an elderly woman who had passed away earlier in the evening. Nothing unusual. I signed her in, parked her gurney off to the side, and started filling out the paperwork. Standard procedure. Before I had a chance to put her away, though, the second delivery arrived. Same place, same situation. Another elderly patient. I left the first body where it was and turned my attention to the new arrival. The transport guys were chatty, making jokes to lighten the mood. It helped, I guess, but I still felt a bit off. Something about the air in the room felt heavier than usual. When they left, I finished signing in the second body and went back to the first. That's when I noticed it. She wasn't lying flat anymore. When I'd left her, she'd been positioned flat on her back, hands folded neatly across her chest. But now her body was scrunched up, knees slightly bent, arms out to the sides, almost like she was trying to curl into a fetal position. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at her, my mind racing to come up with an explanation. I hadn't touched her. No one else had been in the room. The gurney hadn't been bumped or moved. There was no reason for her position to change. I backed away, heart pounding, and practically fell into the chair by the desk. My hands were shaking, and my breath felt ragged, like I couldn't get enough air. I kept glancing at the gurney, half expecting her to move again. The mortician came out a little while later and found me sitting there, pale as a ghost. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I pointed at the gurney, struggling to find the words. "She moved," I finally managed. He frowned, walking over to the body. After a quick look, he burst out laughing. "Relax," he said, shaking his head. "It's just rigor mortis." "Rigor mortis?" I echoed, still feeling like the ground was spinning. "Yeah, happens sometimes. The muscles stiffen up after death, and depending on the condition of the body, they can contract. Some cases are worse than others. Sometimes they'll go back to being limp when it's over." He grinned, clearly enjoying how freaked out I was. "If you think this is bad," he added, "wait till you see one sitting straight up. That'll really mess with you." "Straight up?" I repeated, the words barely escaping my mouth. Yup, seen it happen a few times. You get used to it. Spoiler alert, I didn't get used to it. Not that night anyway. He ended up putting both bodies into cold storage himself while I sat there, staring at my clipboard like it would magically erase what I'd just seen. The rest of the shift was a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The image of her scrunched up body flashing like a bad memory on repeat. Rationally, I understood what the mortician had told me, but it didn't make it any less unsettling. It was one of those nights that reminds you how little control we really have, and how even after death, the human body has a way of surprising you. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget it. Story 5. The chapel was quiet, just the way I liked it in the afternoon. I'd wrapped up most of my duties for the day as the superintendent of a cemetery and crematory, and the stillness in the building always gave me a sense of calm. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting muted hues across the polished floor. The old piano in the corner stood like an overlooked relic, its dark wood worn, but dignified. It hadn't been touched in years, not since long before I started here. But today I'd learned just how much that piano had to say. I had a habit of reading Mortician stories during my downtime. I'd scroll through forums and threads, curious about what my colleagues across the industry had experienced. Some tales were funny, others bizarre, but the ones that really got under my skin were the creepy ones. The whispered voices, the unexplained movements, the cold spots that left seasoned morticians scratching their heads. As I read these stories, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of gratitude. Thank God none of that has ever happened to me, I thought, settling deeper into my chair. And then, as if on cue, the piano played a single note. The sound was soft but unmistakable, a hollow, resonant tone that hung in the air just long enough to make me freeze. I looked up slowly, my eyes fixing on the piano. The keys were clean and dust-free, polished weekly as part of chapel upkeep, but they hadn't been played since I started working here. No one touched it, and yet the sound rang out like a whisper in the empty room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the building had shifted, causing the piano to shift and create the sound. Or perhaps I hadn't heard it at all. Maybe I was too absorbed in the stories I'd been reading, and my imagination had decided to mess with me. With forced calm, I glanced back at the screen and continued reading, determined not to dwell on it, but the room didn't feel the same anymore. The air had changed, heavier, colder. I could feel my pulse quicken as I glanced toward the piano again. Nothing moved. The room was as still as ever. Minutes passed, and I convinced myself it was nothing. A fluke, a coincidence. Then the piano played again. This time the note was higher pitched, sharper, and more deliberate. I snapped my head up, my hands gripping the edge of my chair. Every rational explanation I'd conjured a few minutes earlier flew out the window. The chapel was empty, the doors locked, and I was the only living person inside. The sound wasn't random. It was too clear, too intentional. I stood, my legs unsteady as I walked toward the piano. Each step echoed faintly through the room, my shoes scuffing against the stone floor. The stained glass windows seemed dimmer, the sunlight muted as I approached. The piano sat there, silent now, its glossy surface betraying no secrets. I stared at the keys, waiting for them to move, but they were still, perfectly still. I hesitated, my breath coming in shallow, uneven waves. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. It felt ridiculous, but something about the room made me feel watched, as though an unseen presence was holding back laughter. No reply. Nothing moved, just me and the piano. With a shaky hand, I lifted the lid, exposing the strings inside. Everything looked normal. No vibrations, no movement. My rational side tried to assert itself again. Maybe the mechanics of the piano were faulty, causing the strings to misfire. But this was an old piano, built decades before electric models became commonplace. There was no circuitry, no mechanism that could explain what I'd heard. Then as my hand hovered above the strings, the piano played another note. I dropped the lid and stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The note hung in the air, longer this time, before fading into silence. I turned toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. My logical side, the part of me that always kept things practical and orderly, had been overwhelmed. The piano played two notes now, quick and consecutive, almost playful. I didn't stick around to see if there would be a third. My hands fumbled with the door handle as I pushed it open, stepping into the hallway and locking the chapel behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The eerie calm of the building felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I spent the rest of the afternoon avoiding the chapel, busying myself with paperwork in the main office. Whenever I thought about heading back inside, my stomach turned. I couldn't stop replaying the sequence of sounds in my mind, the hollow, deliberate notes that seemed to echo with intent. Each time the image of that piano stood vivid in my mind, as though it were waiting for me to return. When I finally locked up for the day, I paused outside the chapel door, the key heavy in my hand. The stained glass windows shimmered faintly in the evening light, casting shifting shadows across the ground. I stared at the piano through the small window in the door, half expecting it to play again. It didn't. But the weight in the air, the same heaviness I'd felt earlier, hadn't left. To this day, I haven't touched that piano. I've considered moving it out of the chapel, but something about it feels rooted to the space, like it belongs there in a way I can't explain. Whenever I walk past, I glance at it out of the corner of my eye, half hoping and half dreading that I'll hear those notes again. I'll never know who or what played it. And maybe that's for the best. Some questions don't need answers, and some mysteries are better left undisturbed. But one thing's for certain, I won't be sitting in that chapel to wind down my afternoon anymore. The piano's made sure of that. Story 6. I was working as a custodian at a funeral home about 7 years ago, a job I took on because I needed the money, and night shifts seemed like an easy gig. I wasn't thrilled about the setting, but I figured I'd get through it. The funeral home wasn't huge, just a small chapel with an overflow room to the side, a hallway with bathrooms, a couple of offices, and next door, a detached mortuary building where the real work happened. The first few nights were manageable. Sure, I was nervous. Who wouldn't be, working alone at a funeral home in the dead of night? But nothing out of the ordinary happened, and I started thinking maybe this job wouldn't be so bad after all. That was until my 4th night on the job. Things started normal enough. I finished up cleaning the chapel and decided to check the detached mortuary building. I didn't really have to clean much in there. It was more of a quick walkthrough to make sure everything was in order. The building always gave me the creeps. The air in there felt colder, heavier, but I chalked that up to being surrounded by death. It was my job, after all. I stepped inside, did my usual scan with the flashlight, and was just about to leave when I heard it. A sharp metallic sound. A clatter, like something falling and hitting the floor. I froze, my pulse quickening. I turned, shining my flashlight back toward the stainless steel tables and equipment. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Nothing looked out of place. For a moment, I debated walking over to investigate, but something in my gut told me not to. The silence in the room was suffocating, and the shadows cast by my flashlight seemed darker than they had any right to be. I whispered, "Screw it," under my breath, turned on my heel and walked out without looking back. I figured that was the end of it. Whatever had fallen, the morning staff could deal with. I headed back into the main building, ready to put away my supplies and get out of there for the night. That's when things got worse. As I was putting the cleaning supplies back in the storage closet, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone sitting in one of the chapel pews. It was just a flash, but it was enough to stop me cold. Whoever or whatever it was stood up and walked away, disappearing toward the rear of the room. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the pews, expecting to see something. There was nothing. The chapel was empty, silent. My heart was pounding now, and the rational part of my brain tried to convince me it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake it. The image was too clear, too real. I tried to gather myself, locking up the chapel as quickly as I could. I was almost out the door when it happened again. A loud bang, a door slamming somewhere inside the building. The sound reverberated through the hall, making me jump so badly I nearly dropped my keys. My chest tightened, and I felt like the walls were closing in. I turned toward the source of the noise, but the hallway stretched out in eerie silence, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to see what was behind that door. I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing through the halls as I sprinted to my car. I didn't stop to check if the door was locked properly, didn't even glance back at the building as I started the engine and sped off. That night was enough for me to realize I wasn't cut out for this job. I lasted 2 more shifts before calling it quits. Nothing happened on those last nights, but the damage was done. Every sound in that building felt sinister after what I'd experienced, and every flicker of light made my skin crawl. Maybe the building's age was to blame, but the fear I felt in those moments was too real to brush off. Some jobs just aren't meant for everyone. And as it turns out, working alone in a funeral home was never meant for me. Story 7. The crematory was dead silent when I pulled up that night. No pun intended. It was my first solo after-hours drop-off, and I was already on edge. The parking lot was empty, the building dark except for the faint glow of the fluorescence inside. I parked, grabbed my clipboard, and flipped the door alarm off before hauling the bodies in. 2 of them, both boxed and ready for weighing. Routine stuff, or at least it should have been. The hum of the overhead lights was the only sound as I wheeled the gurney inside. The air was cold, stale, and carried that faint metallic smell that always lingered in places like this. I tried not to think about it too much. Just focus on the task. Get in, weigh the bodies, box them, and get out. Easy. I was halfway through weighing the first body when I heard it. A thump. Faint, but distinct. It came from the direction of the retort, the oven. I froze, my hand hovering over the scale, and strained to listen. The fluorescence buzzed overhead, steady and unchanging. Nothing else. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the building settling. Old places like this creak and groan all the time. I went back to work, trying to ignore the way my pulse had picked up. The second body was heavier, and I had to adjust the scale to get an accurate reading. That's when I heard it again. Another thump. Louder this time. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like something was moving inside the retort. I stopped cold, my breath catching in my throat. The ovens were off. I knew that for a fact. There was no reason for anything to be moving in there. I stood still, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Nothing, just the hum of the lights and the faint creak of the building. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe something had shifted inside the oven, a loose piece of metal or debris settling. I forced myself to keep going, boxing the bodies as quickly as I could. But the air felt heavier now, like the room was pressing in on me. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of the gurney wheels, the rustle of the plastic wrapping, the faint click of the scale. Then it happened again, a muffled bang, followed by a series of smaller thumps. This time it didn't stop. The noise was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, echoing faintly from inside the retort. My stomach dropped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could think about was every horror movie I'd ever seen, every story about things that shouldn't be alive but somehow were. There's a demon in there, I thought. A fucking grudge demon, waiting to scamper up the ceiling and drop on me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the oven like it was about to burst open. The noises stopped eventually, fading into silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. I finished boxing the bodies in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tape the lids shut. I didn't bother cleaning up or double-checking the paperwork. I just grabbed my clipboard, flipped the door alarm back on, and bolted for the car. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm me down. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't look back at the building as I drove away. I couldn't. Whatever was in there, it could stay there. I wasn't about to find out, and to this day I still get chills every time I think about that night. The thumps, the bangs, the way the air felt like it was alive. I've made plenty of after-hours drop-offs since then, but I've never stayed in a crematory alone again. Some things, you just don't mess with. And that night, that was one of them. Story 8. It was just another quiet morning at the funeral home when the call came in. I'd been working here for a few years, handling everything from body pickups to preservation and makeup, so I was no stranger to the strange or uncomfortable. But this was something else. The day started normal enough. I was in the back room organizing supplies when my boss called out, "Hey, we've got a body to pick up. Can you handle it?" I grabbed my clipboard and headed to the office. "Where's it coming from?" I asked. The boss looked up from his desk, his expression a little too casual. "Out back," he said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Out back?" I repeated, confused. I'd never had to pick up a body from here before. Bodies came from hospitals, nursing homes, sometimes private residences, but not out back. The boss didn't elaborate. He just motioned toward the door. "You'll see." I stepped outside, still trying to figure out what he meant. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels too clean for the kind of work we do. And then I saw it, a large blue tarp spread neatly on the pavement behind the building. On top of it was a woman's body, lying completely still. It took me a moment to process what I was looking at. The woman looked familiar, and my stomach dropped as recognition set in. She'd been in the funeral home just a few days ago. I remembered her clearly, early 30s, soft-spoken, with a kind of calm about her that felt out of place. She'd sat across from me in the arrangement room, going over every detail of her own funeral like she was planning a dinner party. She knew exactly what she wanted: a closed casket, simple flowers, no big speeches. She'd even laughed a little when I asked if she wanted a slideshow of photos. "No need for all that," she'd said. "Just keep it simple." At the time, I'd assumed she was planning ahead, the way some people do when they know their time is running out. Maybe she had a terminal illness or some other condition she didn't talk about. It wasn't my place to ask, but now, standing there with her body in front of me, the pieces clicked into place in the worst possible way. She hadn't been planning ahead. She'd been planning this. My hands trembled as I crouched down beside her. She'd laid herself out carefully, dressed in a plain white blouse and jeans. The tarp beneath her was pristine, with no blood or mess visible. I glanced at her hands and saw the gun, small, silver, and neatly placed next to her. She'd made sure everything was clean and contained, as if she didn't want to inconvenience anyone. The sheer calculation of it sent a chill down my spine. She'd paid for her funeral, planned every detail, and then brought herself here to die. Not at home, not somewhere random, but here, where she knew we'd find her. It was methodical, thoughtful even, and that made it all the more unsettling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not sure what to do next. Finally, I called the boss. He came outside, took one look at the scene, and let out a long sigh. "Well," he said, "at least she made it easy for us." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing with questions I'd never get answers to. What had driven her to this? Why here, of all places? And how had she been so calm about it, knowing what she was going to do? The rest of the morning was a blur. We called the proper authorities, followed protocol, and eventually brought her inside. Handling her body felt different than any I'd worked with before. There was a weight to it, not physical, but emotional, like I was carrying more than just her remains. Later, as we prepped her for the funeral she'd planned so meticulously, I couldn't shake the haunting thought of her sitting in the arrangement room, smiling faintly as she chose her flowers and music. She must have known exactly how it would end, and yet she'd seemed so at peace. It was the kind of thing that sticks with you, no matter how much you try to move on. I've worked on countless cases since then, but hers is the one I can't forget. Story 9. I never thought I'd have a story worth sharing. Being a mortician was just a job, a practical role with a clear purpose. Take care of the dead so their loved ones could say goodbye. I'd seen a lot during my time, from peaceful expressions that made it hard to believe someone was gone to the chaos of unexpected deaths that left little time for preparation. But one night, it's always a night, isn't it? I learned just how unpredictable this line of work could be. It was late, somewhere past midnight, in the embalming room of the funeral home. The air was cold, a chill that seemed to linger no matter how tightly I shut the windows or adjusted the thermostat. The room was mostly quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak from the building settling. I'd been working on preparing the body of a middle-aged man who died a couple of days prior, a task that had become as routine as clockwork. Preservation, makeup, the usual steps. This particular case wasn't complicated. The family had requested a modest viewing, simple attire, natural makeup, no fancy arrangements. As I worked, I hummed softly to myself, just to break up the silence. It wasn't out of comfort but habit, a way to keep the quiet from becoming too oppressive. I turned my back for just a moment, rifling through a drawer for a tool I needed. It wasn't even a minute, probably closer to 30 seconds, when I heard something behind me. A faint rustling sound, so slight it could have been my own breath shifting papers on the counter. I froze halfway through pulling the drawer open and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing moved. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd bumped the gurney without realizing it. Maybe it was just the fabric settling, or maybe I was tired and hearing things. I'd been working long hours lately. With a sigh, I turned back to the drawer, grabbed what I needed, and stepped toward the body. That's when he sat up. It was so sudden I almost didn't register what was happening. 1 second he was lying flat on the gurney, his hands folded neatly across his chest. The next he was upright, his back stiff and his head slightly tilted. His eyes were closed, his expression unchanged, but his whole torso had lifted, like some unseen force had yanked him into position. I screamed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the tile walls. The tool I was holding clattered to the floor, my hands too shaky to keep hold of it. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stumbled backward, practically tripping over myself as I scrambled for the door. I didn't leave the room, though. Something stopped me. It wasn't courage or curiosity, it was confusion. My logical brain fought against the terror, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Bodies don't sit up. This doesn't happen. But it had happened, and I was standing there staring at him, frozen and useless. Finally, I forced myself closer, keeping a safe distance but moving just enough to see what had happened. The man's posture remained rigid, his hands still folded neatly across his chest. There was no twitching, no movement, no sound, just stillness. My breath hitched as I looked at him, the quiet around me suffocating. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. It was cold as expected and completely stiff. I gently pushed, the way you'd guide someone back into bed. To my shock, his body didn't resist. It flopped back onto the gurney, limp and lifeless, as though nothing had happened at all. And that's when I realized what it was. Rigor mortis. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or spirit or anything else my panicked mind had conjured up. It was science. Simple, unavoidable science. When rigor mortis sets in, the muscles stiffen, sometimes contracting so forcefully that the body moves. Occasionally, it's enough to make a corpse sit up. I laughed, the sound shaky and bordering on hysterical. Relief washed over me like a wave, though my legs still felt like jelly as I leaned against the counter for support. Of course it's rigor mortis. What else would it be? The explanation was comforting, even if the experience hadn't been. I cleaned up the tools I'd dropped, finished the preparation, and put the body into cold storage. When I locked up for the night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, even though I knew it wasn't as dramatic as it had felt in the moment. The image of the man sitting up was burned into my memory, as vivid as if it had just happened. It's been years now, but I still tell this story whenever someone asks me about my strangest experiences. The reaction is always the same, a mix of horror and fascination with a touch of disbelief. Story 10, I've been in the funeral business for 6 years. It's not exactly glamorous work, but someone has to do it. I've seen my share of oddities, strange families, unconventional requests, but paranormal? Not much, nearly none. That said, there was this one night that I haven't been able to shake from my mind. It started with a call from a nursing home at 1 a.m. I was on call, which meant if anyone passed away during the night, I'd be the one to take care of things. This nursing home was familiar to me. I'd been there dozens of times. The layout, the staff, even the lighting. It was routine. Nothing strange had ever happened there before. I drove over, met the nurse on duty, and she pointed me to the room. "Ruth Smith," she said softly as we walked down the dimly lit hallway. "Room 112. I opened the door and stepped inside. It was quiet except for the faint hum of an old radiator in the corner. On the bed lay a smallish old woman, plump at the hips but not overweight. She looked like someone's kind grandmother, peaceful and still. Just by looking at her, I estimated she weighed about 130 pounds. I turned away from the bed toward my gurney, preparing it for the transfer. But as I glanced up again, something caught my eye. A grayish, sparkly cloud in the corner of the room. It wasn't smoke, but it wasn't light either. It shimmered like static on a TV screen, or the way your vision turns fuzzy when you get lightheaded. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. When I looked at another part of the room, it was gone. But when I looked back at that corner, the cloud was still there. I tried to ignore it. This kind of work already makes your mind wander into strange places, and I figured it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I positioned the gurney next to the bed, wrapped Mrs. Smith in a sheet, and started to pull her over. Someone her size should have slid right over with minimal effort. Instead, she didn't move an inch. Confused, I checked the edge of the bed. No obstruction, just mattress. I tried again, this time bracing myself first and giving her a stronger tug. Nothing. It was like she weighed 400 pounds. Sweat began to beat on my forehead, frustration mixing with unease. I changed my approach, maneuvering her body differently, and she finally started to move. But it wasn't smooth. It felt like someone was pulling her back from the opposite side, resisting me. I pulled harder and harder, and when I managed to get half her body onto the gurney, the resistance suddenly stopped. She moved normally after that, sliding onto the gurney like she should have from the start. The shift was so abrupt, I nearly yanked her off the gurney entirely. My hands were trembling as I buckled her in and covered her with the quilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room, like something I couldn't see had been holding her back. I wheeled her out to my van, loaded her inside, and climbed into the driver's seat. Because I have no idea what happens after death, I treat every deceased person as if they're still present in some way. I talk to them politely, like I would a living person. It's just my way of showing respect. "All right, Ruth," I said as I started the engine. "Let's get you out of here." But then, clear as day, I heard a voice in my head, not out loud, but inside my mind. It was sharp, distinct, and loud enough to make me freeze. "It's Alice." I felt my breath catch. It wasn't my imagination. I didn't hear it with my ears, but it was so real it might as well have been. I glanced at the quilt covering her body in the back of the van. "Okay, Alice it is," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "Let's go, Alice." When I arrived at the funeral home and began the process of unloading her, I braced myself for the same resistance I'd encountered in her room. But there was none. She moved easily from the gurney to the lift, her weight feeling completely normal for someone of her size and shape. I slid her into the refrigerator, closed the door, and labeled it with her name. Then I sat down to fill out her intake paperwork. That's when it happened again. From the garage came the unmistakable sound of music, a cheerful, old-fashioned tune, like something you'd hear on an antique radio. My immediate thought was that my phone was in the van and had somehow started playing music on its own. I'd had it plugged into the stereo during the drive, so it made sense. I got up, muttering to myself, and walked toward the garage to shut it off. But as soon as I crossed the threshold into the garage, two things happened simultaneously. The music stopped, and I felt my phone in my pocket, silent and still. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where the van was parked. The quiet was oppressive, thick like a blanket. It didn't feel like the room had gone silent. It felt like the sound had been pulled out of it. I didn't linger. I walked back inside, ready to finish the paperwork and go home. But as I sat down at my desk, another wave of unease washed over me. I grabbed the pre-need file that had been left out for Ruth Smith. On the index tab, it said Smith, Ruth, just as the nursing home had indicated. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. On the info sheet, in bold lettering, it was noted that Mrs. Smith preferred to be called by her middle name, Alice. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.